In a city where money separates the powerful from the forgotten, a single moment can erase that line forever. The city was alive with flashing neon signs, honking cars, and the endless buzz of people moving past each other, lost in their own lives. The streets were busy, filled with businessmen in expensive suits and tourists snapping photos of the towering buildings that seemed to touch the sky. It was a world of movement, of people too caught up in their own lives to notice the ones who didn't belong. But 12-year-old Elijah Carter noticed everything. He had no home to go back to, no parents to lean on, and no safety to trust. Elijah's world was the streets, a place where the only thing constant was the struggle. He didn't have the luxury of a warm bed or even a meal every day. His existence was spent in the alleys, in doorways, scavenging what he could. He was invisible to most, treated like part of the city's backdrop, never seen unless someone needed to look down on him. Every day, Elijah hustled for survival, cleaning car windows for spare change, gathering cans from the street, and doing whatever he could to make sure he could eat. It was a harsh life, but it was his life. Every day was about making it through another night. The world never stopped for kids like him. It never noticed him, or any of the others like him, tucked away in the shadows of the city. He was used to it by now, being invisible, being treated like he didn't matter. The wealthy and the powerful walked past without even a glance. They didn't see the poverty or the desperation that surrounded them. They didn't see kids like Elijah. Today was no different, or so Elijah thought. It was still daylight, the sun shining down on the busy downtown streets, casting long shadows between the towering buildings. The sidewalk buzzed with the sounds of people hurrying about. Businessmen striding past, their shoes clicking on the pavement as they moved from one meeting to the next. Tourists wandering, snapping pictures of the city's landmarks. Amid the chaos, Elijah kept to himself, moving along, knowing not to stand out. But then, something unusual caught his eye. Across the street, a sleek black car pulled up, its windows tinted and the doors swinging open. A woman stepped out, dressed in a fancy outfit, her heels clicking against the pavement. She was surrounded by a wave of business people, but Elijah noticed something about her. She seemed to float above the noise of the city. She was different from the others. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't distracted by her phone. She seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Elijah felt a strange pull. It was the kind of glance that most people would have looked away from, but for a moment he stood still. He wasn't sure why, but something about her calmness made him wonder what it would be like to be seen. Not as just another face in the crowd, not as someone who was always invisible, but someone who was noticed, who mattered. The thought quickly left his mind as he kept walking. There was no time for daydreams in his life, no room for wondering what it would be like to be someone else. Elijah's life was about survival, and today, like every other day, he was just trying to get by. He turned the corner, pulling his hoodie tighter around him. There was a cold wind, but it didn't bother him. It was just another part of life on the streets, cold, lonely, and relentless. He walked, unnoticed by the busy world around him. Just another kid surviving the best way he knew how. As the day wore on, Elijah's thoughts shifted back to survival, back to the search for food, for something to drink, for the chance to keep going. The world kept moving around him, and he kept moving with it, always just outside the city's notice. Always unnoticed. This was the city Elijah lived in. The world of the rich and powerful, the world of flashing neon signs and glass buildings, a world that never saw the ones who were struggling, the ones who were forgotten. But today, something might change. Something he couldn't see was already set in motion. It was just another day in a city where the wealthy walked past, oblivious to the ones who lived on the other side. And for Elijah, it was just one more step in his fight to survive. The noise of the street filled Elijah's ears, the honking cars, the chatter of vendors, and the shuffle of footsteps from people too busy to notice anything beyond their own worlds. He stood there, watching the crowd pass by, searching for scraps of food or coins. It was a typical day for him, unseen, unnoticed, just one more face in the city's tapestry. But then the air shifted. A cry, desperate, panicked, and piercing, cut through the noise, grabbing Elijah's attention. He froze. It wasn't just the usual chaos of the city. This was something urgent, something that couldn't be ignored. "Help! My son! He's not breathing!" A man's voice, strained with fear, called out from somewhere nearby. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the crowd. And there, near the curb, he saw him, an older man in a sharp, expensive suit, holding a limp baby in his arms. The baby's tiny chest barely moved. Its lips were turning a ghostly pale. The man's hands shook as he desperately tried to rouse the child, his panic so evident that it seemed to hang in the air. Elijah knew this moment wasn't like anything else. The man was wealthy. His suit, his polished shoes, and his demeanor screamed success. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the life of the baby in his arms, and Elijah could see it was slipping away. The man's wealth couldn't help him now. The power of his money meant nothing in the face of this crisis. Around them, the city's usual indifference took hold. People froze. Some simply stared. Others, too engrossed in their phones, barely registered what was happening, pulling out their cameras to record. But no one moved to help. No one did anything. Elijah's instincts kicked in. He knew what it felt like to be invisible. He knew what it felt like to be ignored. But this was different. This was a life in danger. The baby didn't have time for hesitation. He didn't have time for judgment. The rules that said street kids like him shouldn't get involved. They didn't matter now. Elijah wasn't about to stand by and watch. Not this time. Without a second thought, he broke into a sprint, weaving between the honking cars, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely noticed the screech of tires or the honks of impatience as he dashed across the busy street. His eyes stayed fixed on the man, his focus solely on getting to that baby before it was too late. The man's head snapped up in surprise as Elijah skidded to a halt right in front of him, panting and breathless. "I know what to do," Elijah gasped, his words tumbling out in a rush. He didn't wait for permission. The man stood frozen for a moment, his wide eyes flicking from Elijah to the baby, then back to Elijah. His shock was palpable, but Elijah didn't have time to wait. The baby was so small, so fragile. Elijah knelt down, his hands gently brushing the child's face. He could feel the coldness of the baby's skin and the shallow, weak breaths. This was a race against time. His mind flashed to the first aid training he'd learned by watching YouTube videos and reading whatever he could get his hands on. He didn't have a hospital, didn't have fancy equipment, but he had his hands, his focus, and his will to save this baby's life. The man stood there for a moment, still uncertain, still in disbelief that someone, especially a boy like Elijah, was taking charge of the situation. But Elijah was beyond hesitation. He quickly shifted the baby, placing her on her back on the cold pavement, using a quick and gentle technique to open the airway. His fingers shook as he positioned the baby's head, making sure her chest wasn't obstructed. The world around him faded into the background. The traffic, the onlookers, the noise, all that mattered was the tiny life in front of him. The baby's breaths were shallow, but Elijah kept going, pushing down on her chest, repeating the motions until, finally, a cough, a small sound, but enough to give him hope. The baby's color began to return, a small flush in her cheeks as she let out a weak cry. Elijah let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. The world felt still for a moment, like the chaos of the city had paused just for him and the baby. The man's hands trembled as he knelt down beside Elijah, his eyes filled with gratitude. You saved her," he whispered, his voice cracking. Elijah looked up at him, his chest still tight. "She's gonna be okay." The man nodded, still in shock, not quite believing that it had all happened so fast. The crowd had stopped whispering. Some had pulled away from their phones. Some had moved closer, drawn by the intensity of the moment. For the first time, Elijah felt seen, but he wasn't sure how he felt about it. His heart was still racing, but there was something else, something unfamiliar. He hadn't done it for attention. He hadn't done it for any reward. He had just acted, just like anyone else should have. But sometimes the world didn't work like that. Sometimes it didn't see a boy like him. But today, for once, maybe the world would see something else. "Thank you," the man said, his voice full of emotion. Elijah nodded, stepping back, suddenly unsure of what to do next. The baby was safe. That was all that mattered. "Where are you watching from and what time is it?" The moment the baby let out a full cry, Elijah stepped back, his hands still trembling. The relief was overwhelming, and for a split second, the chaos of the world around him faded. The baby was breathing again, alive, and that was all that mattered. The man, still kneeling on the pavement, held his son close, his eyes wide in disbelief. He stared at Elijah, not with anger or fear, but with something deeper, gratitude. His son was safe, all because of this boy with a dirty shirt and worn-out shoes, someone who society would normally ignore. Elijah didn't wait for words. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but he knew he couldn't stand there any longer. The moment had passed. The baby was safe. But the world hadn't changed. It never did. He turned to walk away, feeling the sting of sweat and exhaustion. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. He didn't need to stick around for thanks or recognition. But as he moved away from the scene, something in the air shifted. The people who had stood by, watching without helping, were now staring at him. The whispers began. A street kid had touched a rich man's baby. They had seen him. They had seen Elijah. But now they were seeing more than just a boy from the streets. They were seeing a child who had acted when the others hadn't, who had saved a life when no one else would. The whispers grew louder, more intense. Some stared in horror, as though Elijah's presence had somehow violated the delicate world they lived in. Others looked at him in awe, surprised by the quiet bravery of a boy who wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't dressed the part. He didn't look the part. But somehow he had still stepped up when it mattered most. Elijah tried to ignore the stares, but they stung, deep in his chest. He had saved the baby. He had done the right thing. Why couldn't that be enough? Before he could walk any further, the man looked at him again, his expression shifting. This time, there was more than gratitude in his eyes. There was suspicion. Elijah felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew what it meant to be judged based on his appearance. He had lived it every day of his life. But this time, it felt different. The man wasn't just grateful anymore. He was thinking, analyzing, questioning. Elijah stopped in his tracks, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had done the right thing, but now the man's gaze felt like it was weighing him down, like he was looking at a street kid who didn't belong in this world of wealth and power. The sound of sirens reached their ears, loud, fast, and getting closer. Police lights reflected off the glass of the nearby buildings. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had saved the baby. But he knew how quickly things could change in the eyes of authority. He knew that no matter how much good he had done, it wouldn't matter if they saw him as a problem. The man's eyes widened as the police car pulled up. Elijah's chest tightened. He was suddenly very aware of how small he was, how easy it would be for people with money and power to make him disappear. The sirens echoed louder, and Elijah took a deep breath. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what the man would say or how the police would react. But he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let them make him the villain in this story. The police officers stepped out of the car, their uniforms crisp, their movements fast and precise. They walked toward the man, who was now cradling his baby, still in shock. Elijah felt their eyes land on him, sizing him up, ready to take action. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be treated like he had. The man, still holding his son, nodded toward Elijah. The officers stopped in their tracks, their eyes shifting from the man to the boy, standing on the edge of the scene. The tension in the air was thick. It was as if the world was waiting to see what would happen next. Would the officers see the truth? Would they see a boy who had saved a life? Or would they see something else, something they had been trained to fear? Elijah looked up at the man, his heart racing, wondering what would happen next. He had done the right thing. He had acted in the face of danger. But now the world was judging him, and he wasn't sure if it would ever let him go. The officers didn't move. The man stepped forward, still clutching his son, and he spoke. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. "This boy saved my child. He's the reason my son is alive right now. You need to let him go." Elijah's breath caught in his chest. For the first time, he felt seen, truly seen, not as a problem or a stereotype, but as a person who had done something good. The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, they nodded, their stance relaxing. They hadn't expected that. But the whispers didn't stop. They never would. A black SUV screeched to a halt on the asphalt, sending dust spiraling into the air. The sharp screech of the tires echoed across the street, adding to the tension that already hung heavy in the air. The doors of the SUV flew open, and two uniformed police officers jumped out. Their hands hovered near their belts, ready for action, as they took in the scene before them. Their eyes fell on Elijah, small, ragged, and standing too close to a wealthy man's child. The officers didn't wait for explanations. They assumed the worst. "Step away from the child," one officer commanded, his voice loud and stern. Elijah's heart thudded painfully in his chest. Not again, not like this. The officer's words felt like an accusation, a judgment, before he even had the chance to explain himself. Elijah had been blamed before for things he didn't do, had been dismissed as a problem simply because of his appearance and where he came from. He wasn't naive. He knew the world saw him differently than it saw others, especially when he was near people like the man in the suit, someone with power, money, and influence. He swallowed hard, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. His hands still trembled from the adrenaline that surged through him when he had saved the baby. But now, it seemed like the world was about to collapse in on him again. He was just trying to help. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a villain. But in this moment, he was the one being accused. Before he could even take a step back, the man, the rich man, stepped forward, his expression still a mix of shock and disbelief. His voice trembled but remained firm as he looked the officers in the eye. "No," the man said, shaking his head slowly, his grip tightening around his child. "He saved my son's life." The officers froze as if the words themselves were a shock to their system. The air hung in suspension. No one had expected that. No one had expected the man in the suit, the one with the power, the one who could erase any problem with a snap of his fingers, to stand up for Elijah, a boy from the streets, a boy they didn't care to understand. Elijah felt his chest tighten as he looked up at the man, his heart racing. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything, or destroy everything. The man had just spoken for him. He had just called him a hero. Elijah had never been seen like this before, not by anyone. People had always looked past him, turned a blind eye to his existence, to his struggles. But this man, the father of the baby he had saved, was doing something that felt like a lifeline. He was standing in front of Elijah, in front of the officers, and telling them the truth. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, as if they weren't sure how to process this new reality. They were trained to see Elijah in one way, to see a kid from the streets as a problem, as a threat. But now, the situation had shifted. Now, the man with all the power, all the wealth, was saying that this boy, this problem, had saved his son's life. For a moment, everything was still. Elijah's wide eyes locked with the man's, and for the first time in his life, he saw something he hadn't seen before: respect. The man was looking at him like he wasn't just a street kid, like he wasn't a threat. He was looking at him like he was someone who had done something important, something worth standing up for. The officers were still silent, still processing, but Elijah didn't care about them right now. He didn't care about the whispers or the judgment of the world. He had done something good. He had done something right. Finally, one of the officers, a woman with a stern face, took a step back. Her posture softened ever so slightly, as if the weight of the man's words had made her reconsider. She nodded curtly toward the other officer, and they both took a step away, giving Elijah the space he needed. Elijah, still standing close to the baby, took a deep breath. His body felt like it was made of stone, but his mind was racing. The tension was still thick in the air, but something had shifted. Something had changed. The world wasn't the same as it had been moments ago. And for the first time, Elijah felt like he was seen, not for where he came from, not for his clothes or his circumstances, but for who he was, a kid who had acted when no one else would. The man knelt down in front of Elijah, bringing their faces to eye level. His eyes were full of gratitude, full of an understanding that Elijah couldn't quite put into words. "What's your name, son?" the man asked, his voice steady but warm. Jeremiah, Elijah stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled softly. "Well, Jeremiah, you're a hero. Thank you. I owe you more than words can say." Elijah blinked, unsure of how to respond. The word hero felt foreign to him. He had never thought of himself as anything more than just another kid trying to survive. But here, in this moment, someone was calling him something different, something that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, his life was worth more than the world had ever given him credit for. And for the first time in his life, Elijah allowed himself to believe it. The next morning, Elijah sat on the same street corner, his back pressed against the cold brick wall of the building. The noise of the city buzzed around him, but it felt distant, as if he were in another world. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the events from the night before. Had it all really happened? Had the man, Ethan Montgomery, the millionaire, really stood up for him? And more importantly, had he really saved his son's life? The night had felt like a dream, like the kind of thing that could only happen to someone else. A street kid like him? Saving a billionaire's child? It seemed impossible, unreal. Elijah shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He had always known that his life was different, that people like him were overlooked, dismissed, ignored. And yet, last night, something had shifted. Something had changed. But what did it mean? As he sat there, lost in thought, a sleek black car pulled up beside him, its tires whispering against the pavement. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. His stomach tightened. Was this it? Was he in trouble? Had the police been called? Would he be dragged away for doing something that wasn't his fault? The car door opened, and there stood the same man from the night before. Ethan Montgomery, his face calm but intense. Elijah stood up slowly, unsure of what was about to happen. The man's presence still felt like power, like everything around him was made of something different, something Elijah had never been able to touch. The man stepped toward Elijah, his eyes softening for a moment. Then he knelt in front of him. The world around them seemed to pause. "Here," Ethan said, holding out an envelope. Elijah looked at it, his brow furrowing. What was this? Was it an apology? An offer to make everything go away? Was this some kind of charity that he could take? But when Ethan spoke again, his voice was steady, firm. Inside is a check for $10 million. Elijah froze. His mind couldn't process the words. $10 million? He stared at the envelope as if it might disappear in front of him. Was this a joke? Was the man messing with him? "Man, you're messing with me," Elijah laughed nervously, unsure of how else to react. But Ethan's face didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. "No," Ethan said, his tone serious. "You saved my son's life, and I want to save yours." Elijah's eyes widened. This couldn't be real. No one in his life had ever given him anything, certainly not something this big. His entire existence had been a fight for survival. He had never dreamed that something like this could happen to him. Was it a bribe, a trick, or maybe something he'd never fully understand? Ethan took a step back, watching Elijah carefully, as if waiting for him to do something. The envelope felt like a weight in his hands, like it was more than just money, more than just a check. It felt like a chance, a way out, a door that could open into something better than the life Elijah had known. He glanced at the check inside the envelope, his hands trembling. The numbers on it were more than he could comprehend. $10 million. A lifetime's worth of dreams. A chance to leave the streets, to leave behind the fear, the cold, and the hunger. His breath caught in his chest. The possibilities were endless. What could he do with that kind of money? What could his mother do? What kind of future could he build with just that check? But then, the reality of it hit him. What was he supposed to do? What kind of person would he become if he accepted something like this? Was it a gift? Or was it a way to make him indebted? Was there a catch he wasn't seeing? The world he lived in had always been transactional. People gave and took, but nothing was ever truly free. Was this man giving him something for nothing? Or did he want something in return? Elijah's mind raced. He was just a kid. He didn't know how to handle something like this. His life had been about survival, about figuring out where to sleep, what to eat, and how to make it through another day. But this was a chance to change everything. After what felt like an eternity, Elijah slowly took the envelope from Ethan's hands. His fingers trembled, but he didn't pull away. He didn't know what was next. He didn't know what would happen if he accepted it, if he let this stranger's offer change his life. Ethan watched him quietly, his face unreadable. Elijah looked up at him, a mix of gratitude and uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know what to say," he whispered. His voice shook, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied, his voice softening. "Just know that this is your chance. Do what you want with it. You don't have to be invisible anymore." Elijah nodded slowly, still unsure of what to do. But as he looked down at the envelope in his hands, he realized that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe this was his moment. Maybe this was the start of something better. He looked up at Ethan again, a small smile forming on his face. "Thank you," Elijah whispered, though the words didn't seem to capture what he was feeling. "Thank you for the chance. Thank you for believing in him." Elijah wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he might just have a future worth fighting for. A week had passed since Elijah's life had taken a turn no one, least of all him, could have predicted. He stood at the threshold of a new home, the door opening to a world that felt foreign, yet welcoming. The house was warm, quiet, and filled with light. Nothing like the cold, harsh streets he'd known for so long. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, and soft light filtered through the windows, casting a serene glow over everything. This was no longer a shelter or a temporary stop. This was a real home. For the first time in his 12 years, Elijah wasn't bracing himself for the cold of a street corner, the sound of sirens in the distance, or the gnawing ache of hunger. There would be no more moving from one alley to the next, no more scrounging for whatever scraps he could find, no more being invisible in a world that didn't care about the people on the margins. The weight of survival, the daily battle just to get through the next moment, had finally lifted. When Mr. Donovan, Ethan Montgomery's assistant, had shown up at Elijah's spot on the street, the decision he made to take Elijah in was life-changing. The check Ethan had handed him was not just an offer of money. It was the key to something bigger, the promise of a future, the offer to be seen. Mr. Donovan hadn't just given Elijah money to survive. He had set up a bank account, put resources aside for his education, and opened the door to opportunities Elijah had never dared to dream of. "Take it as a new beginning," Mr. Donovan had told him. "You saved my son's life. The least I can do is help you live the life you deserve." Elijah had been overwhelmed, unsure at first of how to process the enormity of the gesture. His heart raced every time he thought of the night that had started it all, the moment when he'd reached out and saved a stranger's child, never expecting anything in return. It was a world of risk and uncertainty, and yet here he was, standing in the middle of a new chapter where the stakes no longer felt as impossible. Now, standing in his own room, Elijah took in the soft comfort of the bed beneath him. The warm, heavy quilt was a luxury he had never known. He ran his fingers across the fabric, marveling at the softness. He had always dreamed of something like this, something other kids took for granted. To just lie down and close his eyes without fearing the sounds of the streets creeping in. He looked around. The room was modest but comforting. The walls were painted a soft blues, and a small desk was placed by the window, overlooking the city that once felt like a maze he could never escape. The city was still busy, alive with the same energy it always had, but from this window it felt different. It felt possible. He wasn't lost anymore. He had a place, a future. Elijah went to the window, gazing out at the view. The streets he had roamed so many times, the alleys he'd slept in, the places that had shaped him into who he was, all of that was still there. But now it was distant, a world apart from where he stood. For the first time, Elijah felt the weight of hope. It wasn't something that had ever been afforded to him before. He had always known that survival was the goal, but the idea of thriving, of truly living, had never seemed like something within his reach. And yet, here he was. For the first time in his life, he felt a quiet certainty. Maybe this was what a second chance felt like. As he looked down at the bustling city below, he whispered to himself, maybe this is what a second chance feels like. He didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if everything would always be this easy. But what he did know was that for the first time in his life, someone had chosen him. Someone had looked past the streets, past his appearance, and had seen the person he could become. For once, he wasn't invisible. Elijah sat down on the bed and let the silence of the room wash over him. There was so much more to be done, so much more to learn. But for now, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, but also new opportunities. Tomorrow, he would wake up with hope. As the sunlight filtered through the window, he whispered again, almost as if to confirm it for himself. This is just the beginning. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living.